There we go. Okay, so and Mindful is from Arizona. Woo, I hope it's nice there. Hope it's nice there. So good to see you, everyone with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Today we're talking about eye anatomy. We're going to do this a little differently than we usually do. I'm going to turn off this back light as well. Just hang on a sec, because it casts a really bad reflection on the screen for our Instagram friends, and we want them to actually see the screen clearly too, right? Excellent. And we've got Tamara joining us on Instagram, and Jam Low as well is there. And we've got Rita on the webinar. Woohoo, go us. We are cooking with gas today. Actually, you know, I just got an induction cooktop. Oh my goodness, do I love it. Just have to throw that in on the side. Let's talk about eye anatomy. Now, this is going to be interesting because I'd like a show of hands. How many of you have studied the anatomy of the eye just from the perspective of maybe a high school biology class or university biology class? If you have, just give me a wave, raise your hand, let me know. We've got Heather from PEI. Excellent. Glad you're with us, Heather. Have you studied the anatomy of the eye just in a general perspective? Yeah? All right. So when we did this in high school, we learned about the structures and the function of the eye, but we didn't learn a particular focus that I'm going to share with you today, because when we are iridologists, we are not as interested in, oh, and Heather says she teaches anatomy to medical secretaries. Right on. This will be interesting for you, Heather. We're not as interested in things like the retina and the lens and things like that. We are more interested, obviously, in the iris, right? In the iris. So we are going to be looking at it strictly from the perspective of an iridologist today. Now, I just wanted to also let you know, for those of you who've been hanging out with me for a while, we've been doing these 11 a.m. webinars, Instagram lives, Facebook lives on Tuesdays and Fridays for the longest time. But starting next week, we're moving to Wednesday and Friday. So just wanted to put in a little plug here that Wednesday, April 1st, we're going to be talking about iridology myths and fables. There are a ton of myths and fables out there. Things that people are teaching as gospel true, things like the owl story. We'll talk about that one. And lots of other things. And so please join me Wednesday, April 1st, even though it's April Fool's Day, at 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. So the same time as today. There's the registration link, bit.ly Wednesday Masterclass, and all the dots and hyphens in there, right? Hi, Sandra. Good to see you there. And Laura and Sarah, good to have you on the webinar with us. Thanks for being there. So Wednesday, April 1st, 11 a.m., we'll be covering iridology myths and fables. If you've been around iridology for any length of time, or if you've been scoping out the YouTube channels, you're going to find that what we talk about Wednesday will be very interesting, because it's going to kind of crush some of what's out there and debunk it and hopefully get it off your radar. All right. So again, I'm really wanting some interaction today. You know, we're all living kind of in physical isolation right now. And so I'd love it if you'd make comments. I keep looking away from my camera because I'm watching my Facebook group. Ooh, we've got Sherilyn joining us from Portland, Oregon on Facebook. Yay, welcome Sherilyn. And so no matter which platform you're joining me on, I'd love some interaction. I'm craving human contact, and this is as close as we get to have right now, right? Okay, so when let's start with the very beginning of this. And the very beginning of eye anatomy is that when we do photos for iridology, we are up close. We are so super close. So for example, this is one of my iridology setups. And when we're taking a picture with this, we are literally like this with a macro lens. So what that means is we are not going to see on those photos the inner edge of the eye. We're not going to see the nose. So it's going to cut off right about here and right about here. So we lose all the facial landmarks. So how do we know when we're looking at just an iris image, what is a left eye and what is a right eye? This would be a little bit of, this is good dinner conversation. did you know, right? Did you know? Throw this out tonight when you're having supper and see if anybody knows what you're talking about. Did you know that your pupil is actually not in the center of your iris? If you knew that, I want you to raise your hand. Let me know. Did you know that? Or is that news to you? I'm serious. I want to have some feedback here, folks. The pupil is always off center. And when we look at it, and Lua Crystal knew this, yes, so glad you did. That's exciting. Sarah didn't know that. Heather says it's new to her. Oh, Heather, that is so cool. I'm going to show you how you can tell which eye is which eye. And Heather, this is so cool because you teach anatomy. So I'm so glad I could teach you something today. All right, so pupil's always off center. And the side of the iris that is the narrowest, when we look at that off center, names the eye. So when you're looking at this, if the narrow side of the iris as compared to the opposite side, if the narrow side is on the right side of the iris, then it's a right eye. If the narrow side is on the left side of the iris, it's a left eye. Now that is really important in iridology because if we get our lefts and rights mixed up, we're in deep trouble. Now I've got to tell you, I did not learn this for like the first 20 years of being an iridologist. Nobody taught me this. And I would take photos, and back then we were doing print photos, and they were very close up as well. And sometimes we wouldn't have our landmarks, and sometimes I would totally mix up the lefts and rights. I'd do a complete analysis with the eyes crossed the wrong way. And it was like, oh, and I'd go, this isn't making sense with what I remember from looking at the person's face. And so the next time they'd be in, I would have a look with my magnifying glass and I'd go, oops, let's put these the way they belong. And we would fix the mistakes I had made. But now that I know this, yes, the narrow side names the eye. So if the narrow side is on the right side, it's a right eye. On the left side, it's a left eye. Sometimes the pupil is almost centered. And so when I'm working off photos, I actually have a ruler and I will blow this up huge on my screen and I will measure it out. Lua Crystal says, I'm studying iridology on university here in Brazil, and I learned this week. Yeah, right on. That is super. So if you need to keep a ruler handy, do, because it's better to be precise and look like you're being precise, which is what you are, and get it right, than to get it totally wrong, right? I'm totally a believer that our clients would rather we used reference material in their presence to verify things than that we screw it up. Got it? Awesome. All right, so let's look at an eyeball. This is an image that you're all familiar with. If you've done anything with eyes, you're familiar with images like this, the cross section from the side, right? And we learn all kinds of things when we are looking at an iris or at an eyeball this way. So let's just kind of go through things here and see what we learn. So we're going to do a little bit of a review of general anatomy of the eye before we dive into iridology specific anatomy. The first thing we need to know is that the eye itself is the largest neural receptor in the body. This is the largest nerve ending you own. And we have the optic nerve right here at the back of the eye. And so this truly is that largest neural receptor. So just like you've got neural receptors in your hand and you touch something hot and you go, you've got a heat receptor. You've got heat receptor nerves, right? They are not connected directly to your brain. They have sections of nerve with synaptic gaps, and the message has to go along the nerve. It's a chemical experience across the synaptic gap, another chemical experience, and it goes up very, very quick, but it's many nerves to get that message of that was hot from the tip of your finger to your brain. Your eye, on the other hand, this is one continuous nerve to the optic zones in your brain. Isn't that cool? The eyeball has two fluid-filled chambers. It has a small chamber at the front called the anterior chamber. Anterior is in the front up, and a larger fluid-filled chamber at the back called the posterior chamber. Okay, these two chambers are divided largely by the iris and the lens. And the lens is held in place by ciliary muscles, and the iris itself has muscle in it as well. When we look at the pupil, which is this opening right here, the pupil's actually a hole. It's actually a hole, right? It has to be a hole. It has to be a hole for the light to get through it. So it is actually a hole. So the image or the light comes in through the hole, and as you probably remember, the lens actually inverts the image. It flips it right over, and that means that that it is shone on the retina upside down, and the nerves, the optic nerve and the rods and cones and things like that in the retina interpret the message and send that to your brain, and your brain interprets it. All right. Then we have, I'm just going to bring my camera around here for just a moment while I grab this. Then we have the eyeball. The eyeball is totally encased in a really tough membrane that is made up of two parts. And this is important. So we have the sclera, which is the white part of your eye, and it makes up the bulk of the outer coating of your eye. But then you also have the cornea. Now the cornea is continuous with the sclera, but it's clear. And it of course has to be clear or images would not get through. So as we look at that on our diagram, we've got the tough white outer coating called the sclera that is continuous with the cornea. Now in iridology, we actually do a little bit of an assessment with the cornea because it can contain some very dynamic things that we need to be aware of as well. Again, the optic nerve exits the back of the eye, not exactly the center of the back, but it exits from the back part of the eye, and it splits into two pathways. This is so important. This is, again, the general anatomy side. So one of the pathways, and I just need to flip my camera around here for Instagram. One of those pathways from your say your right eye goes straight back, and the other one crosses over to the other side. So on the left side of your head, it's here and it crosses straight over. So there's a place in your brain where they cross over, and that is what gives us binocular vision and depth perception. Where they cross over is called the optic chiasm. All righty. So we're getting there. We're getting there. When I'm showing you this diagram, which you'll recognize is, let me come back here. I'm going to, sorry, bring that back for these guys. So we're going to look at just this front part of the eyeball now. This is where we're getting iris specific. So this is that front part of the eye. Now I'm doing this to set us up for what comes next, because what comes next is we are actually going to look at just this piece right here in a different diagram. You with me? So we're lasering in on what we want to look at. This is that little part that we just talked about. So I'm going to flip back one more time. So we're going to look at the iris, just this piece exactly right here. As we look at it, this is what we see. This is going to be really intense here. Tons of information. You probably want to take notes. All right. The first and most important thing we want to look at is called the anterior border layer. And that is this very top frontmost layer here. Now, this layer is critically important because this layer is, the cornea actually is coming up in front of this because the cornea is not a part of the iris. Then we have the anterior chamber. Then we have the iris itself, and we have the anterior border layer. This is the layer that holds the iris pigment. So if you have really dark brown eyes, this is the layer that is holding all of that pigment, and it's holding it right in the topmost layer of the iris. Now, I want you to think for a minute. If you had had a piece of glass, for instance, that was on top of a piece of fabric. And if you were to take and paint that glass with dark brown paint, would you be able to see the fabric beneath it? Would you? If you've got a layer of brown paint on top of glass, and then you've got fabric underneath, would you see the fabric? Yes, no, maybe, X-ray vision is needed. What do you think? No. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Absolutely. That is the exact same thing that happens here. When we have a lot of pigment in here, it hides everything that's happening beneath it. And it can make it a little more challenging to analyze a brown eye, but with practice, it actually becomes quite easy. We can get a lot of information from that. If, on the other hand, you have a blue eye, which means you have very little pigment in your eye, it's like having a piece of glass laid on top of a piece of fabric. And because there's no paint on that glass, you can see the fabric just fine. And that's why with a blue eye, we see way more detail than we do with a brown eye. And that's why with the eye type that's in the middle, that's kind of between the two, called a biliary eye, we see some definition and some details, but not all typically. All right. Then the next thing we want to look at in the iris is called the stroma. And the stroma is everything in here. It's everything between the anterior border layer, which is the very front, and the posterior membrane or the posterior epithelium. So everything in here is the stroma. Someone once described this as being like apple pie. This is the top crust, this is the bottom crust, and this is the pie filling. So if that helps you to understand that we've got layers here, then that's a good thing. This stroma, or the apple pie filling, is made up of fibers that we call trabeculae. There'll be a spelling test. And the trabeculae are actually very, very fine capillaries. But they are coated with a white coating. That coating is a collagen sheath. And we do things when we see various markings with that. We also, in the stroma, have nerves, and we have blood vessels, and we have muscle fibers of different kinds. And so there's a lot going on in here, and this is not very thick. If you consider that the posterior epithelium is only 2 cells thick, and it's very, very, very dark, it's either dark brown or black. And if this is roughly accurate for proportions, the iris itself is not very thick at all. All right, then we have the dilator muscle. Do you see right here, there's a little bit of thickening coming across here. Can you see that? This is the dilator muscle. And this is the muscle that actually is responsible for opening up the iris to let more light in. Okay. Now, as you know, for those of you who've done some anatomy and physiology, every muscle that goes one direction has a muscle that moves the body a different direction, right? So you've got your bicep and you've got your tricep. If you only had a bicep, you'd never be able to straighten your arm without doing this. The same is true of your iris. You've got the dilator muscle that opens up the pupil, but we need to have a way to close it down, and that is the sphincter muscle right here. So where the dilator muscle radiates outward like this, the sphincter muscle is like this. Because the sphincter muscle, when it contracts, does this. And when the dilator muscle, which is out here, is contracting, getting shorter, it's going to pull on tissues that literally pulls the sphincter muscle apart like this. Right? Is this all making sense? Is this fitting for you? All right. Now back to this posterior epithelium. 2 layers thick, very dark brown or black. I remember doing cow and sheep eye dissections in junior high and high school. For those of you who don't have junior high and high school, that would have been grade 7 or 7th grade, and what grade was I think it was grade 10 or 10th grade. I have to be bilingual on these, speak American and Canadian, right? And so I remember seeing that the back of the iris, even in cow eyes, is very, very dark. But of course, I couldn't see that it wrapped around here. Now, this posterior epithelium is extremely light sensitive. And so when light hits this part of the posterior epithelium, so this is the pupil over here. This is the edge of the iris that touches against or that is at the pupil's edge. When light hits this, this is what triggers either the sphincter muscle to constrict, or if not enough light is hitting this, it's what triggers the dilator muscle to constrict. Is that making sense? So we're really talking about how the eye works, and we need to know all of this when we do iridology. So important. So again, we've got that little diagram right there. Here we have a beautiful lymphatic eye, a biliary eye, and a hematogenic eye. You might know those as blue, hazel, and brown. And so the blue eye, again, has no pigment or very little. This has a little bit of pigment here, which would actually be sitting right here in the eye. For those of you on Instagram, let's get this over here. That pigment is actually sitting really close to this landmark. But you'll see that when we're looking at this, I'm going to move my camera closer for Instagram. When we compare these, you can see that there's different shading in this eye. There's areas that look very dark, gray, or even black, right? And as we see different shadings, the darker it is, the deeper we're looking. The more layers of fiber we are looking down into. And we often don't see the shading like that in a true brown eye. We see other pigment, that big dark blotch that's up at about the 1 o'clock mark in this eye is extra pigment sitting on the surface. So when we are seeing shading in an eye, or when we're seeing something like this or like this, we've got this stroma layer that is actually has genetically programmed, it has separations. And when we have separations, we start to look down into the depth of the stroma. Does that make sense? So it's if you've ever been to ice fields or you've ever been rock climbing and you've looked down a crevasse and you've seen how dark it is down there, that's exactly what we're looking at on these eyes. We're looking into a crevasse in the iris, but the iris is so tiny that the crevasse only needs to be microns deep for it to look very darkly shaded. All right, how are we doing so far? Is this working for you? I just need to update my Facebook so I can see if there's any more comments coming in over there. So we've talked a little bit about, okay, so my computer is moving super slow, and it's gone to the wrong page. Just give me a half a second to fix this little issue because we are supposed to be right there. Okay, so talking about the muscles, the dilator muscle and the sphincter muscle. So I'm going to pop back. No, I'm not. This is obviously the pupil. This is the iris. And this is the eye as if we're looking at a two-dimensional diagram from the front. All right, so as we're looking at this, the sphincter muscle, do you remember we saw that on the diagram? As I mentioned, it goes around and around and around like this. And those muscle fibers literally overlap. When that muscle contracts, those muscle fibers ratchet together. As they ratchet together, the pupil gets smaller and lets less light in. And it's doing that as a response usually to light, that there's too much light. We don't want that much to get in. And so, but once it's down small like that, here's what I want you to notice. The dilator muscle anchors in at the edge of the sphincter muscle, and it anchors in at the edge of the sclera. Now this edge where it's anchored in here at the edge of the sclera is a hard anchor, which means this edge of the iris is never going to move. These two, where the dilator and the sphincter muscle join, this isn't rooted to anything. They are just connected like this. So what that means is, let me try to do this better, like this. Why am I challenged this way? Spatially challenged today, folks, just saying. So what that means is when the dilator muscle constricts and gets shorter, it pulls on the sphincter muscle and stretches it out and opens up the iris. When the sphincter muscle contracts, it pulls, but its job is to straighten out the dilator muscle. Does that make sense? Is that fitting for you? All right. We know that the iris itself has over 28,000 nerve endings, and we don't know what they all do. We know that the dilator muscle is very specifically controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, and the sphincter muscle is as well. Sorry, the sphincter muscle is controlled by the parasympathetic system. My bad there. The dilator is controlled by sympathetic. The sphincter is controlled by parasympathetic. So sympathetic means you're responding to a stress, right? And so you've got to be able to see more clearly. The sphincter muscle is about bringing you back down and balancing you out, bringing you back into your homeostatic level. And so it's a parasympathetic response. So as we know all of that, we then know that, again, there are 28,000 nerve endings in that little tiny iris. And we don't know what most of them do. When we're looking at an eye, can you see that this eye has this different shade right in here? Can you see this? How close are the nerve rings? Sarah, I'm not understanding your question. How close are the nerve rings? Can you expand on that for me? So as we see this, can you see that there's a different shade right in here? I call that the pom-pom zone, but don't ever use that term with an iridologist, okay? Unless you're talking to me. I just use that because it looks like it's a pom-pom attached to the center of the eye, right? Attached to the pupil. This is accurately and precisely the constrictor ring, the constrictor muscle. And we can see it clearly because, remember we talked about how the stroma has lots of layers of trabeculae in it? And we talked about that when we see a separation like this with shading in it, we are looking down into the layers of the stroma. We're looking between trabeculae. Here, there's at least one entire layer of trabeculae missing. So if we have lots of layers of fiber, you can understand that whatever is beneath that fiber, whatever's down here, you're not going to see. But if we are missing a layer or two of fiber, it makes it easier for us to see through to see what is beneath. And that is where we're looking at the stomach ring. So Sarah said, looking from the eye diagram you showed, how far down do nerve rings go? Nerve ring depth are not separations in fibers. Nerve rings are crinkles in fibers. Okay, so I'm just going to pop back a few. We'll come back to this concept in just a second, but I need to come back here. When we see this, these could be nerve rings. Nerve rings are not separations, they are crinkles. And so we're not looking down into the depth of the eye. Think of, for instance, if you wear blue jeans, for instance, or pants, and you know when you sit down in the fabric in the front of your thigh, where your body and your leg connect, and that fabric gets all wrinkly, because you're cramming this much fabric into this much space when you sit down. That's exactly what creates a nerve ring. What you're calling a nerve ring, what we would call a contraction furrow. So you're not looking down, you're looking at how the fibers are crinkled because they've been compressed. All right, so here again, what we're seeing is the trabeculae. Now, when we talk about seeing fibers in an eye, we are talking about trabeculae. Trabeculae and fibers, we use them sort of interchangeably. I mentioned earlier that the trabeculae, and that's what we've tried to represent here, are actually capillaries that have a collagen coating. And these capillaries, or capillaries, if that's how you say it where you live, come up through the sclera to the edge of the iris. They come in towards the ring. Now you noticed here, we've got this ring coming around here. So these trabeculae start at the edge, come back out and go back towards the edge. So they do a hairpin turn. They do the exact same thing opposite on the inner part of that. So they start at the iris, or the inner edge of the iris, go out towards that ring, do a hairpin turn and come back. So any flow that's going from an edge, whether it's the inner edge or the outer edge, is arterial flow. Any flow that's going out, back out to the edges, is venous flow. Okay, because we've got to have both oxygen-rich blood coming in to nourish the eye, and we've got to have the blood that is oxygen deficient going away again. So that's very, very important. So this iris, this is actually the focus of iridology, right? When we are looking at the eyes, we are looking at the fiber structure. We are looking at the color patterns. We're looking at how things are in the eye. Constitutional iridology specifically studies the patterns and the structure and the base color and the surface pigment. We know that the way the fibers are sitting is inherent. It's been passed down through generations. And of course, as our gene structure changes with each generation, because we've got two people that are not genetically related, probably getting married and giving half of their DNA to the child. So we now have a mixing of what comes from each parent, so that it looks like the gene structure is changing a little bit. So we're looking at the fiber, which is genetically predisposed. It's inherently predisposed. It's what's passed down. The base color is passed down inherently. But when we have extra pigment or extra colors on top, that is a personal thing. That is a personal thing. That's what the person has inherited for themselves. Constitutional iridologists should never, and we're taught to never, and we really teach to never, have I underscored that enough for you? To never do an iris analysis without background information. Iridology isn't a crystal ball. Iridology is not a party game. We need to have a conversation with the client. So what that looks like for me is that a client comes in, I will ask them, what would they like my help with? What is their list of health concerns? Then I will ask them a few getting to know them questions. Then I will take photographs of their eyes and I'll pop those photos up on my big screen. And then I'm looking at the eye in the context of what are my client's concerns. That's my first analysis. And I never do an everything I see analysis with a client. That is overwhelming and unnecessary and frustrating, right? So I always look at the eye in the context of, what does my client need to know now to take them to the next step in their health, to take them up a level in their health? That is so, so important. So let's have a look at what this actually looks like. You with me? Let's do an iris analysis here and let's see what this looks like. This is a female client who came to me a while back, and Sarah's going, yay, I think she's excited about doing an iris analysis. Way to go. Love it. I love the passion there, Sarah. Yay. Mid-30s. She's had fertility issues. She's been trying to get pregnant for the last couple of years, and she conceived once, but she miscarried. So let's start with looking at her eyes. Can you see the depths in her eyes? Can you see that we've got fiber separations where we're looking down in? This is not all that common to see in a dark brown eye, but we've got it with her. So we see that she's got the layers of trabeculae. We see that she's got some shading in here, right? We suspect from things that we see in the eye that she might actually have what is known, and some of you might be familiar with this term, the MTHFR defect. Okay, it's a genetic anomaly that messes up how she works with her B vitamins and can have a serious impact on fertility. And so when we're looking at this, we also see, just based on things like her basic eye color and where some key markings are, that liver is probably an inherently predisposed area of risk for her, where she may not be as able to do some things. Now, you know that the liver, you know, we always think about liver as the thing that detoxifies, and it does. Very importantly, it helps us to make cholesterol though, and we need to take that cholesterol to make our hormones. Then the liver has to break down the hormones after they've done their job, and it does that in 2 phases. Phase 1 takes the fat-soluble toxins and breaks them down to be water-soluble. Phase 2 breaks them down further to where the kidneys can actually remove them. So the liver does the detoxifying and the kidneys do the removing. Now, as we look at her eyes, we also see that she has indications that she might actually not work with her B vitamins very well. Not only does her liver not prepare the B vitamins properly, probably, but once they're made, she may not be able to, she may burn through them too quickly, would be the best way of putting it. Do you see that we also have, and I'll try to choose the best image for this. There we go. I think this one is the clearest one. Do you see that there's a bit of a haze over the outer edge of her eye? Yeah, so that suggests again that her liver might not do a good job of handling the carbohydrates to turn them into healthy cholesterol, and it may be actually turning them into cholesterol that's not good for her. Okay, so my first questions, obviously, in a fertility case are, how often do you have a period? And she said that her periods, they used to be 90 days, but she had done a lot of dietary work and gotten them down to about 30 days. Yes, she's understanding the process even before she came in. I asked her about carbohydrate cravings. And she said, yeah, she does, but she really tries when she's craving a carb to do a complex carb or to do vegetables or something like that instead of going for the sweets. Now, she's got a lot of markers in her eye, right? A lot of markers. We've got little ones here and here and here. We don't need to talk about all of these because they're not all relevant. They aren't all going to inform us to help us help her with the fertility challenges. So as we looked at this then, it was very obvious to me that the liver was a key player, that we needed to keep doing some dietary work, and we needed to do some B vitamin work with her. We needed to give her the B vitamins in the right format. That's all I needed to do. I didn't need to get all hung up on every marking that has nothing to do with fertility at this point in time. That would be future sessions. Take care of the immediate problem now, get things working well, and as she's feeling better and better and getting the results she wants, she'll go, oh, and by the way, I have this problem. Can you help me with it too? Right? So we work through this at the pace the client needs us to work through it at. So we actually did those things with her, and it took her about 4 months and she got pregnant. We were very excited, very excited. All right. How does that sound to you? Does that simplify iridology for you, knowing that you're not going to spend hours and hours and hours doing an assessment? That you can actually, when you know iridology, when you know all the markings and what they mean, you can actually do a proper assessment in a client session. And really, all you're going to need is about 10 minutes, if that, to deal with to see the markings you need to see that explain why your client has the symptoms they have, and then move forward with recommendations based on that. Was there anywhere else other than the liver you looked at in the specific case? No, it was strictly liver. We did a little pancreas work with her, but that was dietary. That was dietary because 90-day cycles tells me that she probably was polycystic ovarian syndrome, which the doctors had diagnosed her as, but she didn't tell me that until after I said, have they ever suggested that you might have polycystic ovarian syndrome? She said, yeah, that was the diagnosis years ago. And that's why I cleaned up my diet. And I'm going, yes, she's got good information. And we just needed to build on that. A little more dietary work on the right kinds of supplements. All righty. So do you want to learn more? Do you want to learn more? Would that be very cool? Because if you want to learn more, I'm just going to spend like 3 minutes on this. The next go round of Confident Nutritionist Dynamic Iridology is coming up. This is the only live online, fully mentored iridology course for nutritionists, herbalists, and naturopaths who want to streamline their clinical work without sacrificing client care. What do I mean by that? So many of us as holistic practitioners think the more time we give our clients for free, the better care we're giving. So we'll see the client for the first time, gather information, send them away, go and spend 3 or 4 of our own hours unpaid creating programs for them. And then they come back for a second hour, if we're lucky, to get that program, those recommendations. And that program, because we spent 3 or 4 hours on it, has way more information than they need. They're not at that level yet. They need what they need to get to the next step, not to get through the next 5 years, right? And so in this program, I teach you not just iridology, but how to understand, how to distill it down to what does the client need now? What will they need next? What will they need next? What will they need next? So I'm teaching you iridology and how to use it in a logical, sequential way so that you encourage your client to stick with what you're teaching them because you've simplified it for them, distilled it down to what they actually need right now. And that in turn encourages them to come back periodically to get updates on their program. So it serves them very well. And it also means that you can build a repeat client business. I have clients now. I've been a holistic practitioner for 40 years. Yeah, I know I don't look a day over 29. Just kidding. But I've got clients that have been with me now. I was talking with one the other day. She was in and we did the math. She's been with me for 38 years because this is how I work. Right? I work to teach them what they need to know to get to the next step. And as they get older and their bodies change, they need more and different information. All right, so when is this course starting? The course, we're running it two sections side by side. So one is Thursday. We'll start Thursday, April 16th, 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, so the same time we met today. But if you notice the time zones here, 3 a.m. in Australia is not the best time for a class. I think we would all agree. So we are running the exact same program, Friday, April 17th, 4 to 6 p.m. Mountain Time, because that's 8 a.m. Saturday in Australia. So a much better time for a class. When you go to iridology.education, if you're not already on my mailing list, you're going to see a little pop-up box that asks you if you'd like to sign up to download the very best constitutional iridology map. You opt in for that. That's going to put you on my mailing list, and it's going to help me keep you in the loop for when registration is open. And when you register, you'll choose whether you want the Thursday or the Friday time slot based on what works for you. And you don't get to flip in between and go between, you know, Thursday one time, Friday the next week. It's a 20-week class, so you need to be committed. But everything is recorded for you afterwards. So if you want more information, I encourage you to hop on over to iridology.education/webinar and register for the info webinar that I will be doing on Thursday, April 2nd at 5 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Again, London, England, I apologize to you. That's not a great time, but get up for this. It'll be worth it. It'll be so worth it for you to be in on this webinar to learn more about what's included in the class, who it's best for, how they will benefit, how it will help your clients as well, what's included for materials, for support, all of the goodies that you get with this, and of course, what is the tuition and how do you get registered? So I encourage you to join me for that. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for being with me. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun. And I hope you will join me for the webinar on April 2nd. Hope to see you then. Bye for now. Heather says, thanks, Judith. Loved it. Thank you for saying that, Heather. Really appreciate it. Sarah said, thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you. And Vanda on Facebook is saying thank you as well. Thank you for those lovely comments and the gratitude. I do appreciate it. Hopefully we will see you. Got some thumbs up on Instagram. Lovely. Hopefully we'll see you on Thursday, April 2nd. Iridology.education/webinar is how you get signed up for that one. We'll see you then. Thanks so much and bye for now. Christina, thank you for that, for saying that you appreciate me. I appreciate you appreciating me. Take care.